Be me, Henry, 25. Work as a junior process engineer. It's not a glamorous job, but it's a real one. We make high-tolerance components for heavy industrial machinery. Think giant gears for wind turbines, hydraulic pistons the size of a man. The company is old, been around forever. The main plant is a sprawling complex of brick buildings and corrugated steel sheds. It smells like hot metal, cutting fluid, and ozone from the welders. The air hums with the sound of CNC lathes, milling machines, and the deep thud of the forge press. It's a place where things are made, not just talked about. My job is to bridge the gap between the design guys in the clean office and the guys on the floor who actually make the stuff. I spend most of my day walking the shop floor, checking specs, troubleshooting machine programs, and generally trying to be useful. The guys on the floor are a mixed bunch. A lot of them have been here for 20, 30 years. They know the machines better than the people who designed them. They don't talk a lot, especially not about feelings or whatever. They talk about sports, fishing, problems with their trucks, and the precise feed rate for cutting a particular type of steel alloy. My direct supervisor is Manuel. He's the shop floor foreman. Been with the company since he was 18. Guy is probably in his mid-50s, but looks like he could still wrestle a bear and win. He has this quiet authority that you just don't question. It's not because he's loud or intimidating, it's because he's earned it. He can diagnose a problem with $1 million machine just by the sound it's making. I remember my first few weeks I was struggling with a blueprint for a new component. The tolerances were incredibly tight, and the machining sequence just wasn't making sense. I spent 2 hours staring at it, getting nowhere. Manuel walked by, glanced over my shoulder, didn't say a word, just took the pencil from my hand, tapped it twice on one of the measurements, then pointed at a specific toolpath on the program sheet. I looked, and suddenly it all clicked. The designer had messed up the order of operations. He just nodded once and walked away. That's Manuel. Efficiency in motion and words. So life was pretty normal, predictable. We had a big order come in, a lot of pressure to meet deadlines. Everyone was focused, working hard. Then the email arrived. It came from corporate HR, from a woman named Andrea. I didn't know her well, only saw her during onboarding. She seemed perpetually stressed out. The subject line was in all caps, which is never a good sign. Mandatory workshop, cultivating a proactive and inclusive workplace culture. My heart sank. Another one of these. We had one a couple years back, something about synergy and leveraging our assets. It was 3 hours of a guy in a shiny suit saying absolutely nothing of value. This one sounded worse. The email was full of the usual corporate buzzwords, talking about the need to interrogate our unconscious biases and build a framework for equitable dialogue. It said the workshop was required for all supervisory and engineering staff, and it was scheduled for a Wednesday afternoon, right in the middle of a production run. The whole shop floor would have to stop. A low groan spread through the engineering office as people read the email. I walked out onto the floor to talk to Manuel about rescheduling a calibration test. He was at his standing desk, looking at his own computer monitor with a complete lack of expression. I could see the email on his screen. He just looked up at me and said, "Wednesday is going to be a long day." That was all. The next couple of days, the mood was a little tense. Nobody wanted to go to this thing. It felt like a complete waste of time when we had actual work to do, real deadlines to meet. It felt like a solution to a problem that didn't exist here. We all worked together fine. Nobody cared about anything other than whether you could do your job. You could be from Mars, as long as your welds were clean and your measurements were accurate, you were good. But you don't argue with a mandatory summons from corporate. So, Wednesday came. At 12:45 p.m., the hum of the machinery began to die down as operators powered down their stations. The sudden quiet was almost unsettling. A dozen or so of us filed out of the workshop and headed toward the main administrative building. It was always a weird transition, going from the concrete floors and high ceilings of the plant to the carpeted, low-ceilinged world of the corporate office. We were all in our work clothes, steel-toed boots, some guys with a bit of grease on their shirts. We probably looked like a bunch of barbarians invading their clean, quiet space. We were directed to the main conference room. It was one of those sterile rooms with a big polished table, uncomfortable chairs, and a giant screen on one wall. A few women from accounting and administration were already there, looking just as thrilled to be there as we were. We all kind of shuffled in and took seats, leaving a noticeable gap between the shop guys and the office staff. Manuel sat down at the far end of the table, arms crossed, staring at the blank screen. Andrea from HR was fluttering around nervously, offering people bottled water. She kept giving us these tight, forced smiles. You could tell she was anticipating this going badly. At exactly 1 p.m., the door opened and the trainer walked in. Let's call her Catherine. She was probably in her late 30s. She was wearing a very expensive-looking pantsuit that seemed too formal for our company. She carried a leather briefcase and had this air of absolute, unshakable self-importance. She didn't smile. She scanned the room, and her eyes lingered on the guys from the shop floor with a look that was somewhere between pity and disgust. Andrea introduced her as a leading consultant in the field of transformative social dynamics. My brain immediately shut down. Catherine didn't even acknowledge the introduction. She just walked to the front of the room, plugged her laptop into the projector, and her presentation flashed onto the screen. The title was Deconstructing Privilege, a Framework for Workplace Equity. Oh boy. She started talking. Her voice was sharp, loud, and had this condescending lecturer-like tone. The kind of voice that assumes you're an idiot and it's her job to enlighten you. For the first 20 minutes, she just unloaded a stream of academic jargon. She was talking about hegemony, chiriarchy, intersectionality, phallocentrism, words that meant absolutely nothing to anyone in that room. I looked around. The older guys were just staring blankly. A few of the younger engineers were trying to follow along, looking confused. Manuel hadn't moved a muscle. He was like a stone statue. Catherine didn't seem to care that nobody was engaging. She seemed to feed on the silence, taking it as proof that we were all too simple-minded to understand her genius. Then she moved on to the core of her topic, toxic masculinity. This is where it started to get personal. She put up a slide with a list of traits: stoicism, competitiveness, protectiveness, self-reliance, analytical thinking. She explained that these were not virtues. They were, in her words, the foundational pillars of a toxic system that harms women and men alike. She said that by valuing these traits, we were perpetuating a culture of emotional suppression and aggression. A few of the guys shifted uncomfortably in their seats. These were the very traits that made them good at their jobs. You need to be stoic when a 10-ton piece of equipment malfunctions. You need to be self-reliant when you're troubleshooting a complex problem alone on the night shift. You need to be analytical to read a complex schematic. She was taking the very essence of their competence and reframing it as a moral failing. She started giving examples. Her examples were all from some strange alien world. She talked about mansplaining in university tutorials. She talked about man-terrupting in marketing meetings. She talked about man-spreading on the subway. I looked at the guys in the room. Most of them had started working right out of high school. Their daily commute was in a pickup truck, not a subway. The closest they got to a marketing meeting was seeing a commercial on TV. It was like she was speaking a different language about a different planet. She didn't make a single attempt to connect her ideas to our actual workplace. Not once did she ask a question. Not once did she solicit feedback. It wasn't a workshop. It was a sermon, and we were the sinners. She then told a story about a friend of hers who felt personally violated when a male colleague complimented her on a presentation she gave. Catherine explained that this compliment wasn't a compliment. It was a subtle assertion of dominance, a way for the man to imply he had the authority to judge her work. You could almost hear the collective internal screaming in the room. This was the world she lived in, a world of hidden meanings, secret aggressions, and perpetual victimhood. Our world was about tolerances, pressures, temperatures, and physical reality. If a machine part was a millimeter off, it failed. There was no subtext to debate. It was just wrong. The disconnect was staggering. She paused, took a sip of water, and looked around the room. "I can sense a lot of defensiveness in here," she said, a smug little smile playing on her lips. "That's a very common reaction. It's the fragility of the dominant group when their unearned privilege is finally being examined." Nobody had said a word. She was projecting an argument onto our silence. She was manufacturing a conflict and then congratulating herself for being brave enough to face it. Manuel still hadn't moved. His eyes were fixed on her, but his expression was unreadable. He looked less like he was listening and more like he was observing a strange species of insect. The presentation went on, and on, An hour turned into 90 minutes. She put up charts and graphs that supposedly proved a systemic bias against women in STEM fields. She didn't mention that our company had a scholarship program specifically for women in engineering, or that 2 of our best welders were women. Facts were irrelevant to her narrative. She showed us slides with quotes from feminist authors. She talked about the patriarchal gaze and how the design of everyday objects was inherently biased. At one point, she claimed that air conditioning was sexist because women tended to have a lower metabolic rate and thus felt colder in offices. One of the older mechanics, a guy named Dave, who had worked in the forge for 30 years, actually let out a short, sharp snort of laughter. He tried to disguise it as a cough, but it was too late. Catherine's head snapped in his direction. Her eyes narrowed. "Is there something amusing you'd like to share with the group?" The room went dead silent. Dave, who was used to the 120 decibel roar of the forge, suddenly looked like a kid caught talking in class. He just shook his head and mumbled, "No, ma'am, swallowed wrong." Catherine stared him down for a full 10 seconds before continuing. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. She was enjoying this, enjoying the power she had to make these grown men feel small and stupid. She then pivoted to the concept of emotional labor. She explained that women were constantly forced to perform the exhausting task of managing the emotions of men. She said men were like emotional vampires, incapable of regulating their own feelings and reliant on women to soothe their fragile egos. This was directed at all of us. She looked from face to face as she said it. Her gaze passed over Manuel, who still looked like he was carved from stone. It passed over me, and I just looked down at the table. It passed over guys who had raised families, fought in wars, saved colleagues from industrial accidents. And she was calling us emotional children. The disrespect was so profound it was almost surreal. Andrea from HR looked like she wanted the floor to swallow her whole. She was half hidden in her chair, scribbling furiously on a notepad, probably just to avoid making eye contact with anyone. She had unleashed this person on us, and now she had no idea how to rein her in. After nearly 2 hours, Catherine's presentation finally wound down. A wave of relief started to build in the room. People were already mentally back on the shop floor, thinking about the work that was piling up. But Catherine wasn't finished. She smiled, a truly unpleasant, triumphant smile. "That concludes the theoretical portion of our workshop," she announced. "Now, we move on to the practical application, the part where we do the real work." A collective sense of dread washed over the room. This was going to get worse, much worse. "Accountability is a cornerstone of progress," she continued, pacing back and forth like a general before a battle. "It's not enough to simply acknowledge these systems intellectually. We must acknowledge our role in them, our complicity." She stopped in the center of the room. "We are going to engage in an exercise of restorative justice. An apology is a powerful tool. It is the first step toward healing." She looked directly at the men in the room. All of us. The weight of historical and systemic privilege is real. It is a debt that must be acknowledged. I had no idea where she was going with this, but every instinct in my body was screaming that it was a trap. Then she laid it out. "I want every man in this room to stand up, one by one." She let that hang in the air for a moment. "You will turn to the women present, and you will offer a sincere apology." My blood ran cold. "You will apologize for the unearned advantages you've received. You will apologize for the space you take up, both literally and metaphorically. You will apologize for the systemic barriers that your female colleagues have had to overcome. You will apologize for existing within a system that benefits you at their expense." There was a stunned, absolute silence. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. This wasn't a training exercise. This was a ritual of public humiliation. She wanted us to debase ourselves, to confess to sins we hadn't committed. I looked at the women from accounting. They looked horrified. This wasn't what they wanted. They were just here because the email said mandatory. They were being used as props in her twisted psychodrama. Catherine scanned the room again, her eyes gleaming with fanatical fervor. She was high on her own power. She thought she had us. She thought we were so beaten down by corporate policy and HR mandates that we would just roll over and comply. She thought we would trade our dignity for a quiet life. Her eyes settled on the end of the table. They settled on the silent, unmoving form of the shop floor foreman. "Let's start with you," she said, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness. "Manuel, isn't it? Why don't you be a leader and show the others how it's done? All eyes in the room swiveled to Manuel. The air went from stale to solid. I could hear the faint hum of the server rack in the corner of the room. I could hear Andrea's pen scratching on her notepad, a frantic, nervous sound. Catherine stood there, arms crossed, with that smug, expectant look on her face. She really thought she had him. She thought she had all of us. She saw a simple man in a work shirt and assumed he was simple-minded. She mistook his silence for weakness. A fatal error. Manuel didn't look at her at first. He slowly, deliberately, looked over at the women from accounting. He made eye contact with one of them, a lady who had been with the company for 40 years, and gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod of respect. Then he turned his head and looked directly at Catherine. His face was a mask of calm. No anger, no fear, no emotion at all, just a quiet, profound stillness. A full 5 seconds passed. It felt like an hour. Then he spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence like a diamond cutter through glass. No, just that. One word. It was not a negotiation. It was not a debate. It was a statement of fact. A closing door. Catherine's smile faltered. Just for a second. A flicker of confusion crossed her face. This was not in her script. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice a little tighter now. "I don't think you understand the exercise. This is about creating a safe—" "I understand," Manuel interrupted. His voice was still quiet, but firm. "And I'm not doing it." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The authority in that room had just shifted, and everyone felt it. Catherine's face started to get blotchy. The mask of the calm, enlightened professional was cracking. She realized she couldn't break him. He was immovable. So she made her second mistake. She decided to go after a weaker target. Her eyes scanned the room and landed on me. I was younger. I was in a junior position. I was probably the easiest mark. "All right," she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Let's try someone else. How about you, Henry? You seem like a thoughtful young man. You can show your older colleagues what genuine self-reflection looks like." Suddenly, every eye was on me. My throat went dry. My mind was racing. All the corporate conditioning was kicking in. Don't make waves. Keep your head down. HR is watching. Just say the stupid words and it will all be over. It would be so easy to just stand up, mumble some nonsense, and sit back down. But then I looked at Manuel. He was still sitting there, impassive. He wasn't looking at me. He wasn't trying to influence me. He was just being a rock, a silent testament to quiet dignity. And I thought about my grandfather, who worked in a steel mill his whole life. I thought about my dad, who was a mechanic. I thought about all the men in that room, who got up before dawn, who worked with their hands, who built and fixed things, who took pride in their skills. Men who didn't complain, men who just did the work. And this woman wanted me to stand up and apologize for them, for being like them. Something inside me just solidified. I took a deep breath. I looked right at Catherine, and I shook my head, slowly, deliberately. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. Catherine's face went from blotchy to a deep, dangerous red. "You too?" she hissed. Her voice had lost all its professional polish. Now it was just raw, naked fury. She was losing control of the room, and she knew it. She spun around and pointed at another engineer, a guy named Mike. "What about you? Are you going to hide behind their silence as well?" Mike, who was usually a pretty jovial guy, just stared at her with cold eyes and slowly shook his head. She turned to the next man. And the next. And the next. Each one gave the same response. A silent, resolute shake of the head. It was a quiet rebellion. A dam of unspoken frustration breaking. We weren't a collection of individuals anymore. We were a single, unified entity. And that's when she completely and totally lost it. Her composure shattered into a million pieces. "Unbelievable!" she shrieked, throwing her hands up in the air. "Absolutely unbelievable! The sheer fragility in this room is astounding." Her voice was high-pitched and shrill. She started pacing, almost vibrating with rage. "You are the problem, every single one of you. You sit there with your arms crossed, so defensive, so terrified of looking inward for even a second." She was yelling now, not talking, yelling. Spit was flying from her mouth. Andrea from HR jumped up. "Catherine, please," she stammered. "Let's just take a 5-minute break." "No," Catherine screamed, whirling to face her. I will not be silenced. This is what I'm talking about. This is the toxic masculinity I have to deal with every single day. This hostile, aggressive refusal to engage. The irony was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. We were all sitting in perfect silence, and she was accusing us of being aggressive. She was the only one screaming. She was the only one being hostile. She was having a full-blown toddler tantrum in the middle of a corporate conference room. "You all think you're so tough, don't you?" she sneered, her eyes scanning our faces. "You work with machines? You think that makes you a man? It doesn't. It just makes you emotionally stunted Neanderthals who are terrified of women." The women from accounting were staring at her in abject horror. One of them was slowly pushing her chair back, trying to get further away. This wasn't empowering for them. This was terrifying. They were trapped in a room with a screaming lunatic. Catherine pointed a trembling finger at Manuel. "And you're the worst of all. Their leader. You're poisoning them with your silent, judgmental patriarch bull. You are a dinosaur, and you are holding back progress." Manuel didn't even blink. He just watched her. His calmness was like fuel on her fire. It was driving her insane that she couldn't get a reaction out of him. Her tirade went on for another minute. She accused us of being misogynists, of being secretly insecure, of being the reason the world was a mess. It was a torrent of insults, a shotgun blast of every buzzword she could think of. Finally, she ran out of steam. She stood in the middle of the room, chest heaving, her hair a mess, her expensive pantsuit looking ridiculous. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before. Andrea, who was pale as a ghost, finally found her voice. I think we're done for today," she whispered. "The workshop is over. You can all go back to your duties." Nobody needed to be told twice. As one, the men from the shop floor stood up. We didn't look at Catherine. We didn't look at Andrea. We just turned and walked out of the room. It wasn't a retreat. It was a dismissal. We were simply leaving a situation that was beneath our time and attention. As I walked past Manuel, he put a hand on my shoulder. He just rested it there for a second and gave it a slight squeeze. No words were exchanged, but the message was clear. "You did good. We're in this together. I respect you." It meant more than any praise or promotion I could have ever gotten from corporate. We walked back to the plant in silence. The familiar hum of the emergency generators and the ventilation systems was a welcome sound. It was the sound of reality. Back in the real world, away from the madness of that conference room. Within minutes, the machines were powered back on. The comforting roar of production filled the air. People went back to their stations. The incident was not mentioned. There was no gossip, no discussion. It was like it never happened. But something had changed. There was a new feeling in the air, a sense of camaraderie that hadn't been there before, a shared glance between two operators across the floor, a nod between a welder and a machinist. We had faced something absurd and insulting together, and we had stood our ground. We had done it without shouting, without arguing, without resorting to the tactics of our accuser. We had won with silence and dignity. The next morning, the rumors started to circulate. They came from the office side, trickling down to the shop floor. Catherine's consulting firm had their contract terminated that same afternoon, effective immediately. Apparently, after we left, several of the women from accounting went straight to the head of HR, Andrea's boss, and filed formal complaints. They described Catherine's behavior as unhinged, abusive, and creating a deeply unprofessional and hostile environment for everyone. They made it clear that they felt used as political props and were disgusted by the whole thing. Their testimony was the nail in the coffin. Andrea was also in hot water. She was placed on a performance improvement plan, which is corporate speak for, "You're one mistake away from being fired." She had vetted and hired Catherine. She had allowed the situation to escalate. She had failed completely. The best part was, not a single man from the shop floor had to file a complaint or say a word to anyone in management. Catherine had destroyed herself. Her own venom had been her undoing. It was a perfect self-contained act of justice. A few weeks passed. Life returned to normal, completely. The memory of the workshop began to fade, becoming a sort of ridiculous legend. Then, one afternoon, I was finishing up a new set of schematics for a particularly complex gear assembly. The tolerances were a nightmare, and I had to redesign the entire toolpath sequence 3 times to get it right. I was proud of it. It was good, solid work. I took the final prints down to the shop floor to get Manuel's sign-off. He was at his desk, studying a production schedule. I laid the drawings out in front of him. "New sequence for the EX400 project," I said. He picked them up. His eyes scanned the pages, moving quickly, taking in every detail. He spent a few minutes tracing the tool paths with his finger, checking the material specs, the heat treatment notes. I stood there, waiting for his verdict. He was notoriously hard to please. His standards were higher than anyone's. Finally, he put the schematics down. He looked up from the papers and met my eyes. He tapped the corner of the drawings with his forefinger. "Good work, Henry," he said. Then he took a pen from his pocket, signed the approval box, and slid the prints back to me. And that was it. He turned back to his schedules. But for me, that was everything. That simple, honest praise, earned through skill and hard work from a man I respected. It was worth more than 1,000 corporate workshops. It was real. I walked back to my desk, holding the signed-off prints. From across the shop, I could see the glow of the welders, the sparks flying from the grinders. I could hear the powerful, rhythmic sound of the machines, the sound of men doing their jobs, the sound of a world that made sense. And we hadn't apologized for any of it. Not a single word.